Looks good, it's recording. Thank you for coming. Last week when we got together, we had a problem, and so what I appreciate is this week we're doing part 2 of part 2, and we started last week, but this week we're going to pick back up on the second half of the second chapter. So let's get started. You can see here that we're in part 2, the second half of the chapter. The first half of the chapter, we talked about the Garden of Eden as a womb. We talked about Genesis and the 3 barren women and how they start off in Genesis at the beginning of Israel's history. Specifically, Isaac's mother. Anybody remember who Isaac's mother is? Sarah, very nice. Sarah is the first barren woman in the Bible. Isaac is born. And then Jacob's mother is Rebekah. She's the one that married Isaac. And then Joseph's mother, who was barren, her name? Rachel, exactly. So we started with those 3 barren women in Genesis, and that's one of the things we touched on last week. And so this week we're going to focus on several themes. One of them is the brothers theme, where the younger is favored over the older. The other thing we're going to focus on is the conflict that arises out of that favoring. And then we're also going to talk about the development of that theme over the stories and how reconciliation and forgiveness eventually occurs at the end of Genesis with that theme that is repeated. So we're looking at a change of heart. That's what brings about that reconciliation. So up here, the theme of brothers in conflict begins with Cain and Abel, our first brothers. It's set up with their story. That's how Genesis starts, right after the Garden of Eden. We have 2 brothers, Cain and Abel. One is favored by God, at least their offering is favored. And then Cain, the firstborn, is jealous and has conflict with his brother. And of course, in that story, there's no reconciliation. Cain immediately acts on his jealousy with anger and kills and murders his brother. So there's no reconciliation at all. The next brothers we have that is a developed part of the theme is Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael, of course, being the son of Abraham, the first son of Abraham by Hagar. And then Sarah is barren, but she does give a miraculous birth to Isaac. And he, of course, is the favored son in the account in Genesis, being the second son. This is important and repeated as a theme, even in Jacob and Esau. Once again, Esau is the firstborn, Jacob is favored as the younger. And in the 12 sons of Jacob, the favored sons come later. Reuben, Simeon, they are the oldest, and they are not favored in the story or by God in the story. And Judah, to some degree, but certainly Joseph and Benjamin are the favored sons of the 12 sons of Jacob. So when you see that, when you read those stories, you should ask yourself, why is that? What is God trying to say? And we will begin to unpack that. It's important to recognize, too, that of all 7 themes that we explore in this book, of course there's many others, but of the 7 themes that we explore in this book, all of them begin in Genesis. All of those themes are set up in Genesis. We had discussion questions for this part of the book, chapter 2, that you can look at on the website, of course. And we covered a lot of those discussion questions last week. So we're going to focus on the 2nd and the 6th question today. I'll read it for you. The 2nd question says, consider the character of each brother. Is one good and the other bad? Discuss maturity and integrity as it relates to their behavior and attitudes towards one another and toward God. Do they undergo a transformation? How does this change who God favors? So those are all some good questions we're going to apply to those brothers that we just saw. And then question number 6 says, all of the brothers' stories have conflict. What determines whether there is reconciliation or not? So that's what we're looking at today. These are the themes that we're going to talk about in chapter 2 of the book. of relevant revelation, but they're all in Genesis. The first one, barren women. We've already talked about those 3 barren women that begin the patriarchal history of Israel. We also have brothers in conflict. And quite often the conflict is because of the favoring that God gives to the younger before the older. Why is there a conflict? Why is it that when God favors a younger son, there's a problem?
Is it jealousy?
Jealousy. Why would the older brother be jealous?
Because the older one is usually favored.
Exactly, because humans favor the oldest. It's the expectation that the older son gets the birthright and the blessing. It's the expectation that the older brother would have double the inheritance of all the others. So there's an inherent problem there, a conflict between God and man, because men are expecting the oldest. In other words, the culture and the society expect the oldest to get the favor and the blessing. And that would include the sons and the fathers. They would expect the oldest to get the blessing and the birthright. But God has something different in mind, and that begins in Genesis. God is already setting up completely different expectations from man in Genesis. So the brothers in conflict theme happens, and of course it's related to the younger brother being favored by God. When I teach this in my classes, I have to stop and talk about what favoring really means, because we tend to think that favoring one brother or one son over another son is like spoiling them. And that's a little fair, because of course part of Joseph's problems came to a head when his father gave him a coat of many colors, right? A multicolored ornamented robe from his father is part of what caused the conflict with the brothers to gain intensity and end up in the pit. His brothers were willing to kill him because of their jealousy, primarily because of that coat. So it's true that we have conflict because of the favoring sometimes. It's quite intense. But some of these conflicts get resolved. So we're going to talk about that and look at that. Like we've already said, Cain and Abel, no resolution. It ends in murder. Cain is kicked out, exiled. He has consequences, but he's not killed, even though he deserves death. He's not killed by God. God is showing his favor and mercy very early on. And again, in the Cain and Abel story, God, as we talked about last week, he intervenes. He speaks to Cain and says, if you do what is right, will you not be favored? So God points, even at the very first brother conflict story, he points to the fact that Cain can make it right. That it's within his control to make it right, to be favored. But of course he chooses not to. His jealousy and anger overcomes him. Some of these conflicts do get resolved, and we'll talk about those. Another theme that comes into play in Genesis is the low raised high. That is a theme that reoccurs over and over again. The most immediate example that comes to mind is Joseph. Joseph is literally thrown into a pit in one part of his story, and he is elevated to the palace later. And then when he is wrongly accused and he ends up in prison, he is once again, through God's miraculous intervention, brought back to the palace. So that low raised high theme comes up again and again. We'll see that explored in this chapter. And then related to the resolving of conflict, you'll see that these characters, some of them anyway, have a change of heart. That in the beginning, Jacob is a good example, in the beginning of the story, Jacob is favored by his mother, and he knows that. He acts as though he knows that there's a prophecy about him from birth, that he's the one who's favored even though he's younger. And he deceives his brother, he deceives his father, and he, through deception and manipulation and self-centeredness, presumably, he tricks his father on his deathbed to fulfill that prophecy, or at least it could even be seen as his own selfish ambition. That's what Jacob does. Esau threatens to kill him because Esau, of course, is upset and offended by it, and Jacob leaves. And where he goes, He stays for at least 14 years, and he works 7 years for Rachel until he's deceived by Laban. And then the next 7 years he works to gain money, to gain, of course God blesses him while he's there, but to gain material goods. We find out at the end of the story that he is gaining all of those goods to give them over to Esau to ask forgiveness. That's a big change of heart. Jacob goes from a self-centered deceiver over the course of 7 years having to work for Rachel, whom he loves, and then another 7 years in order to accumulate more things. And he takes them and offers them all to Esau. We find out at the end of that story why Jacob was working that hard. And if he's working that hard for 7 years to make up for what he did wrong, it definitely points to a change of heart. The change of heart theme comes up again in my favorite story, and that's Joseph, and we'll get there too. And then the last theme that is brought up in Genesis is covenant. Just to wrap them up, there's the development of mankind, mirroring the life stages of man, mirroring the life stages of the history of Israel. That is also begun in Genesis. So all 7 themes in the book of relevant revelation are deeply rooted in Genesis, and they kick them all off. So that's a good place to move from here. The theme of barren women. We've already talked about all of these up here again, but related to the theme of covenant, the covenant is established with Abraham. This covenant that Abraham's descendants will be a multitude of people. Abraham is blessed 5 times by God, and it is set up as the covenant with God's people, and that symbol of the covenant is circumcision. All of that starts with Abraham. Abraham is also the first father to have a child by a miraculous birth in the Bible, and that's Isaac. Of course, Sarah is healed of her barrenness. Isaac and Rebekah are the next couple, the product, of course, of Abraham and Sarah. They have a son, Isaac. He is the favored of the second son. He's the favored son. They have Esau and Jacob, and Esau being the older, Jacob being the favored. We've just discussed that story a bit. And then Jacob marries Leah and then Rachel, as the plan was given by Laban. This is interesting to consider because Rachel and Leah are sisters. And this is an interesting point that the Bible takes this turn, because we have these examples of brothers where the younger is favored over the older, and then we even have this theme carried out through the sisters, because Rachel and Leah is the older, Rachel is the younger, but Rachel is the favored, but Leah is still blessed, much like Hagar was in the desert, much like Ishmael was. She shared in the blessing. Leah is the mother of many sons. 5, I believe, came from Leah out of the 12, and a daughter. And she is blessed. There's no doubt. She's blessed by God. But Rachel is the one who is favored, the mother of, again, miraculous birth, because she's barren. God intervenes, and that shows his favor. And, of course, Rachel has 2 children eventually, the youngest, Joseph and Benjamin. Yes, ma'am?
Why, we talked about how, the younger son is favored, but, with Jacob and Leah and Rachel's sons, and, Dinah too, but the, older sons are the ones that, were trying to hurt and get rid of Jacob, but why wasn't Benjamin the favored son instead of Jacob? Is it because, Jacob was, or not Jacob, Joseph. Is it because Joseph was the, first son born of the barren woman? Or, because wouldn't it still be the younger?
Yeah, it does get complicated in that story because there are 12 sons.
Yeah.
It's like when we went over it in class, and I was talking about how this doesn't mean that if you're the youngest, God loves you more than your older brother or sister. I think the Jacob story really shows that. Mm-hmm. It's because of the complexity of the theme being developed with 12 sons. It tends to go a little different. For example, as you said, Rachel is loved by Jacob. We know that. But Leah is loved by God, as is Rachel. Rachel's barren, so she does eventually have these miraculous children. We know Joseph and we know Benjamin are going to be special. But to answer your question, you may remember that Benjamin is favored. It is his descendant that becomes the first king of Israel. So there is a very special blessing on Benjamin in the sense that eventually Saul is the first king of Israel from his tribe. That is an honor, certainly. We know Joseph is favored. And actually, I wanted to go there as an example, so now's probably a pretty good time. When Joseph, is presumably the first of the 12 to die, because at the end of Genesis, it is his sons that are receiving a blessing, and then shortly thereafter, Joseph passes away. The story continues, and all the other brothers are still a part of the story. So, at any rate, at the end of Genesis, we have a blessing of the sons, and it is an important picture of this that shows that this favoring of the younger over the older is not just my imagination or some sort of luck. I mean, at the very end of Genesis, we have Joseph wanting Jacob to bless his children, presumably because he's ill. Either Joseph is ill, certainly Jacob is close to the end of his life, so we know that Jacob is giving the blessing not to Joseph, but to Ephraim and Manasseh. And so let me read this for you. So Joseph saw that his father was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head. He was placing his right hand on Ephraim's head, and he was displeased. So he took a hold of his father's hand to move it from Ephraim's head to Manasseh's head. Joseph said to him, "No, my father, this one is the firstborn. Put your right hand on his head." But his father refused and said, "I know, my son, I know. He too will become a people, and he too will become great. Nevertheless, his younger son will be greater than he, and his descendants will become a group of nations." He blessed them that day and said, "In your name will Israel pronounce this blessing. May God make you like Ephraim and Manasseh." So he put Ephraim ahead of Manasseh. And that is only 1 chapter, 2 chapters from the very end of Genesis. It's the end of Jacob's life. And as we continue in the history of, not to give too much away too early, but as we continue in the history of Israel, Ephraim is the blessed one. The remnant is referred to. The last people group of Israel is referred to as Ephraim by the prophet. So he is blessed as well. Joseph has a special blessing through his son. Benjamin has a special blessing through his descendant Saul. Judah has a very special blessing. We know he is in the genealogy of Christ. So you could argue that Judah is the most blessed. And of course, in the kingdom, Judah is the longer lasting kingdom because it's blessed by God as well. Even more so than Israel, the northern kingdom. So yes, it gets complicated because that theme is getting developed. Because the whole point is God is pointing in a direction that Israel's history goes. There's foreshadowing. There's also development of theme. And so thank you for the question. I hope that helped get us to the end of Genesis with that theme. The younger brother is favored by God. I'm just going to summarize this theme here. We had Cain and Abel. Obviously, Abel is favored. We have the sons of Noah. Their birth order is uncertain and debatable. That may be why they don't seem to fit the pattern. We just simply know that Shem is the ancestor of Israel, and we also know that Ham is cursed, presumably because of his behavior in that story. Ishmael and Isaac are sons of Abraham, and we know Isaac is blessed, but Ishmael does get a blessing from God, showing his mercy and his compassion. Esau and Jacob. Jacob is favored, of course. Esau is also a father of a great nation, the Edomites. There's the 12 brothers. Those are all sons of Jacob. And as we just discussed, that one's a little bit more complicated, but clearly the oldest are not favored. We have Reuben, we have Simeon. Levi is of course the ancestor to all the priests. That's a favoring, but it's not the first or the second born that are favored in that family of 12. And then Manasseh and Ephraim, the section we just read, Ephraim is blessed, not Manasseh. And as we talked about, what does favoring mean? It doesn't mean that God is spoiling that person more than the other. God is just. And He chooses who He chooses, and He favors who He favors so that they are equipped to serve Him. And it's not an easy service. Jacob had to work for 14 years. That was not an easy service. And of course, Christ, favored, goes to the cross. The prophets are favored and used by God, but every one of them has a very difficult life as a result. So it's not necessarily, it's not meant to be, when we think about a favored person of God, we might think of David, and he's a king. His life was very difficult with his sons killing one another, etc. So a favoring of God means being used by God, being chosen by God to do His will, and that often ends not well, or it certainly makes for a very difficult life where men are against you. God can be with you, but men will be against you. Brothers in conflict theme. Cain and Abel obviously had conflict. Noah's sons had great conflict too. Ishmael and Isaac is where we see a conflict that is not resolved. However, at the death of their father Abraham, they do come back together in peace. But there's not a great meeting. There's not hugs and kisses and love and restoration. But they do come together at the death of their father. Notice how Jacob and Esau have a great conflict. We have a lot of information about that conflict, a great deal of dialogue, but we also get a picture of their reconciliation that we talked about before, where Jacob sends his livestock ahead, his children, his wives ahead, obviously operating with humility and no interest in fighting his brother. He is very vulnerable at that meeting. And Esau has all of his army there ready to fight. But he says no. And he goes before Jacob. They embrace and they are forgiven. And Esau says, "Come stay with me." And Jacob says, "Okay." And then he doesn't stay. They go their separate ways. But the point is that there is a beautiful picture of Jacob on his knees asking forgiveness of his brother. And his brother graciously grants it. That's quite a development from Cain and Abel, and even Ishmael and Isaac. And then Leah and Rachel, they have a conflict, a jealousy, but when God restores Rachel and heals her of her barrenness, they too apparently live in harmony after that point. And then we have the 12 brothers, which is the way Genesis ends, and the conflict comes to a head primarily with Joseph. They leave him for dead, sell him into slavery, into Egypt, of course, and then through many tests that the brothers are put under by Joseph, hidden and disguised, of course, when he reveals himself as a great leader in Egypt, the brothers are scared to death. They're afraid that he would retaliate against them, but he does not. He says they have nothing to fear, that he will invite their entire family to Egypt and take care of them there, and they live there in peace and prosperity. And Joseph takes care of them for multiple generations. The change of heart theme. There's no reconciliation without a change of heart. And this is a major theme that leads us ultimately, of course, to Christ. Repentance, changing your ways, changing your heart, asking forgiveness is an important theme in the Bible. And they start here. Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve, when they are corrected, when they are caught in their sin, they blame each other and God. There's no change of heart that we see from Adam and Eve. In Cain and Abel, there's no change of heart. When Cain is corrected and cursed, he says, "Oh, my punishment is too much for me to bear." And he has no change of heart, no remorse. Noah is chosen out of all the people on the planet to live through the flood. No change of heart is needed. He's a righteous man. Esau and Jacob, well, we've already discussed this at length, but Jacob has a great change of heart. In part because of those 7 years that he has to work for someone who deceived him. He learned what it felt like to be deceived, and he came back in a completely different person. You read that story and you read where he deceives his father and lies to his father. And then to fast forward and realize that he's on his knees asking forgiveness from his brother, it doesn't even seem like the same person, because it's not. He has a change of heart. And then Joseph's brothers, of course. Like I said, my favorite story in the book, but Joseph's brothers are tested. And in those tests, as a reader, you can see how they've changed and how they are sorry for what they did and how they would give anything not to break their father's heart by having Joseph killed, because that's what they think they've done. They live with the pain and the guilt for decades, and ultimately they're just ready for it to end. They have paid the price of their guilt, and they are sorry and remorseful. Even Judah, and that's where the story really culminates, when Judah says, "Take me instead of Benjamin." Joseph is concerned that they have mistreated Benjamin all these years. And when he hears Judah say, "Take me instead of Benjamin," he knows that that is not the case, that they have had a change of heart, and that they are truly sorry. Beautiful ending to that story. So that takes us back to the discussion questions. Let's see if we've covered them all. Again, we're focused on 2 and 3. Consider the character of each brother. Is one good and one bad? It's sometimes easy to think of them that way. A bit of an oversimplification, of course, but Jacob and Esau, for example, is one good and one bad? No. You feel sorry for Esau. When he runs off to hunt and Jacob is duping his father, it's clear that if one's good and one's bad, you got to point to Jacob being the bad one. It's not that simple. There's a lot of gray. In every single one of these stories, there's a lot of gray. It's not one good and one bad. However, one is favored, and the one who's favored does not have a simpler or easier life. That's one of the messages of these stories. Discuss maturity and integrity as it relates to their behavior and attitudes towards one another and toward God. Do they undergo a transformation? Yes, they do. They have a change of heart. We've discussed that specifically with the Jacob and Esau and the 12 brothers. And of course, in stark contrast, Cain and Abel. When we work with this in my class, we write comparison contrast papers between the Cain and Abel story and the Jacob and Esau story. And my middle schoolers get it. They see that there's a difference. There's a lot of similarities, but there's also a difference. And the main one being that Jacob and Esau, in the end, are reconciled. And it's because Jacob has had a change of heart. And apparently Esau has too. Or at least he has one quickly when he meets Jacob and forgives him. And then number 6, all the brother stories have conflict. What determines whether there is reconciliation or not? That's why we have the change of heart theme as a focus in this book. It's because of the change of heart that reconciliation is possible. It's because the person wants to get right with their brother that reconciliation and peace is possible. And again, major theme in the Bible, right? We're going to love our enemies. That's where Jesus took it. But at this point, whereas the law says to love your brother, and next it will be love your neighbor. And then eventually, when Jesus comes in, love your enemy. We talked last week about the great question, am I my brother's keeper? And how the rest of the Bible seeks to answer that question. There's a reason why there's brother story after brother story after brother story after brother story. And there's a reason why the favoring occurs again and again and again. I'm very excited about chapter 7 when all of that becomes more clear. But for right now, I'm just glad that we can start the 7 themes because they're all rooted in Genesis. And then we'll be ready for next week. Part 3 is Exodus. So we'll talk about that next week. So can you join me in prayer? Thank you. Dear Lord Jesus, I thank you so much for the opportunity to cover this part of chapter 2. Genesis is so important in the way that it sets up the beginnings of all of Israel's history, but also the beginnings of all of these themes. And I'm grateful that we've had a chance to sort through that together today. I pray that you'd be with each and every member of our Bible study, wherever life takes them between now and when we see each other again. I just pray for our time together next week. I pray for their preparation. I pray for you open up time in their lives to study your word and prepare. And I am very grateful for this opportunity to meet with them and to discuss these themes. And I'm excited about Exodus next week. Thank you for taking care of all of us in the meantime. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Thank you very much.